General didn't even look up from his coffee when I walked in. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the other officers standing around the conference table, not the 3 stars on his shoulder, not even the fact that I was the only woman in a room of 14 men. It was the coffee. He was stirring it slowly, like he had all the time in the world, like my entrance wasn't worth the effort of lifting his eyes. Then Colonel Harrington, the one who'd called me in, cleared his throat. "Sir, this is Captain Evelyn Shaw. She'll be taking point on the Kestrel reconnaissance package." The general finally looked up. He had the kind of face that had spent decades telling people they were wrong. Deep-set eyes, a jaw like a shelf, and a smile that wasn't really a smile, more like the memory of one. "Shaw," he said, "the way you'd say the name of a street you'd never heard of. What's your call sign?" The room got quiet. Not completely quiet, someone was still clicking a pen, but the particular quality of attention shifted. I felt it. "Ghost actual, sir." He set down his coffee. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at Colonel Harrington, then back at me. "That's a heavy name for someone I've never heard of," he said, and 3 of the men at the table laughed, just enough to let me know they were watching for my reaction. I kept my face still. "Yes, sir," I said. "It usually is. I need to back up. I grew up outside Fayetteville, North Carolina, which meant I grew up with the Army in my blood whether I wanted it or not. My father did 2 tours in Vietnam and didn't talk about it. My grandfather did 2 tours in Vietnam and didn't talk about it either. The silence in our house wasn't emptiness. It was the kind that's been packed tight with things nobody had words for. I enlisted at 19 because I didn't know what else to do with the anger I carried around. That's the honest version. The cleaner version is that I believed in service. Both things were true. I went in as an intelligence analyst, scored high enough on the ISVAB that a recruiter told me I could have my pick, and I told him I wanted to understand things before they happened, not after. He wrote something down on his clipboard and nodded like he'd heard that before. I worked my way up. Made sergeant, then warrant officer, then crossed over to a commissioned path through OCS at 26. By 31, I was a captain, attached to a joint task force out of Fort Liberty, what used to be Fort Bragg, running reconnaissance packages for missions I still can't fully describe in public. That's where I met my commanding officer, a lieutenant colonel named Draper. And that's where my real education began. Draper was brilliant. I say that without reservation and without affection, because those 2 things, his brilliance and my eventual hatred of him, can exist in the same sentence. He had an instinct for threat assessment that I've never seen matched. He could read a satellite image the way other people read a face. He knew what questions to ask and which ones to leave alone. He also knew exactly how much space to give a person before he took it all back. The first time he undermined me, I thought I'd misread the situation. We were in a briefing, 4 months into my assignment, and I'd spent 2 weeks building a threat analysis for an operation in a region I won't name. I presented it. He let me finish. Then he said, "Good foundation. I'll have my team refine the conclusions," and moved on. His team, as if what I'd handed him was raw material. I told myself it was seniority. I told myself it was the way things worked. I told myself a lot of things over the next 18 months while he took my work, repackaged it under different language, and presented it to generals as the output of his unit. My name never appeared on a single final report. I've thought about this a lot since then, about why I stayed, why I kept working, why I handed him ammunition every time I produced something good. Part of it was that I genuinely loved the work. Part of it was that I believed, in the stubborn and stupid way that earnest people believe things, that it would eventually be recognized, that someone would notice. Someone did eventually notice, just not in the way I expected. Her name was Major Abena Osebonso. She came into the unit on a temporary assignment, and I noticed her the way you notice someone who's been through the same thing you have. Something in the way she moved through a room, careful, measuring, never quite relaxing her shoulders. We ate lunch together once, then twice, then it became a standing thing. She was from Georgia, had gone to West Point, had a laugh that could fill a hallway. About 2 months into her assignment, she came to find me after a meeting I hadn't been invited to. She sat down across from me and looked at me for a moment before she said anything. How long has he been doing it? I didn't ask what she meant. A while, I said. He presented your orchestral analysis today, she said. I know it was yours because I read the original draft you shared with the coordination team. He changed 3 sentences, that was it. I'd known this was happening, I'd known it for a long time. But hearing someone else say it out loud did something to me that I hadn't anticipated. It made it real in a different way, the way a bruise looks worse once you finally see it in a mirror. He has more rank, I said, because that was the reflex. That's not what I asked, she said. What happened next took 8 months, and I'm going to tell it plainly because the details matter. I started keeping records. Every analysis, every report, every briefing document. I kept the original drafts, time-stamped, backed up on a personal encrypted drive I stored in the safe in my off-post apartment. I didn't know exactly what I was building toward. I just knew that at some point I was going to need the truth to have a paper trail. 3 months in, something changed. Draper brought in a new staff officer, a young captain named Theo. Fresh-faced, ambitious in the transparent way that young men at Fort Liberty could afford to be. Within 6 weeks, Theo was sitting in on briefings that had previously been mine to run. Within 8, Draper had restructured the unit's reporting chain so that I submitted my work to Theo, who submitted it upward. I was being buried, alive, professionally, by a man who needed me to keep producing while ensuring I'd never be positioned to advance. I requested a transfer, it was denied. Draper cited operational continuity. I requested a meeting with the Brigade S2. I was told the colonel was unavailable and that my concerns should be addressed through my chain of command. My chain of command was Draper. I had one conversation with the IG office that went nowhere. The officer I spoke with was polite and wrote things down and told me these situations were complex. I thanked him and drove back to post and sat in my car for 20 minutes before I felt steady enough to go inside. It was Abina who finally said it. You have enough, she told me, sitting at my kitchen table on a Thursday night in February, her hands around a mug of coffee that had gone cold. You've had enough for months. The question is whether you want to use it. Using it means my career here is over, I said. Your career here is already over, she said, not unkindly, just true. I filed the formal complaint in March. I won't romanticize it. It was a thick packet of documentation professionally formatted, submitted through the Inspector General's office with copies to the JAG and to my congressional representative's military liaison. I'd spent 3 weekends putting it together. I'd had a civilian attorney, a retired JAG officer who now practiced in Fayetteville, review it twice. The response was administrative silence. For 6 weeks, nothing. Then I was called into a meeting with a full colonel from the division staff that I'd never met. He told me that a review had been initiated, that I should continue my duties in the interim, and that these things took time. He said it the way people say things they want you to accept without asking follow-up questions. I asked my follow-up questions. He wrote them down without answering them. That was April. In May, Draper was informed that he was the subject of a formal inquiry. I know this because Theo told Abina, who told me. Draper's response, apparently, was to spend 2 days being very calm and then to submit a performance evaluation for me. My annual OER that described my work as adequate and my leadership potential as developing. After 18 months of building intelligence packages that had gone up the chain under his signature, I've thought about that word many times since. Adequate. It's such a careful cruelty. Not failing, not incompetent, just not quite enough. Just enough to keep me in place. The review took 4 months. I spent those 4 months working. What else was I going to do? I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of watching me fall apart, and I wasn't going to disappear into bitterness, which would have been the easier thing. I did my job. I did it well. I kept my timestamps. The findings came back in September. I was in my apartment when Abina called me. It was a Sunday morning. I was drinking coffee and reading the news and trying not to think about anything in particular. It came through, she said. What did they find? Substantiated, she said. On the attribution issue, the restructuring, the OER, all of it. I sat with that for a moment. What happens to him? Letter of reprimand? Filed in his official record. He's being reassigned. Germany, from what I heard. Probably the last posting before retirement. It wasn't a court-martial. It wasn't the thing I'd built in my head during the dark months, the scene where someone in a room full of people said clearly and publicly that what he'd done was wrong. It was a letter in a file that most people would never read. I'd known this was a possible outcome. The attorney had prepared me for it. Okay, I said, there's more, Abina said. The more was this. During the review, the investigating officer had pulled 4 years of intelligence reporting from our unit. A senior analyst at the division level, someone I'd never met, a warrant officer named Kowalczyk, who'd been doing this work for 22 years, had been asked to assess the quality and consistency of the reporting. He'd flagged 17 documents as representing a distinct analytical methodology, a signature approach, consistent framing, consistent risk assessment language, a particular way of structuring source reliability matrices that he said he'd never seen done quite that way anywhere else. All 17 were documents that had gone up under Draper's name. But Kowalczyk had traced them, he'd asked for original drafts, he'd talked to the coordination staff, he'd been methodical about it, in the way that only someone who's spent 22 years being precise can be. His report said, in language I've now memorized, the analytical work represented in these documents reflects a consistent and distinctive intelligence methodology that does not align with the documented training background or prior reporting history of the credited officer. Authorship attribution requires reassessment. Draper's name was removed from those reports in the official archive. Mine was added. I'm not going to pretend that reading that sentence felt like nothing. I transferred out of the unit in October. I'd requested assignment to a training command at Redstone Arsenal in Alabama. Analysis methodology, teaching it to junior officers. It felt like the right thing to do with what I'd learned, both about intelligence work and about institutions. I drove down on a Tuesday morning in a car packed with everything that mattered, which turned out to be less than I expected. I'd given away a lot in the preceding months. Things I thought I needed that I'd been carrying out of habit. The work at Redstone was different from what I was used to. Slower in some ways, faster in others. There's a particular kind of patience required in teaching that hadn't known I had. I was there for about 2 months when I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. Fort Meade area code. The man on the phone introduced himself as a colonel on the Army intelligence staff. He told me that a working group had been commissioned to develop a new analytical framework for multi-domain intelligence operations. He said my name had come up several times during the review process. He said Kowalczyk had specifically recommended me. We'd like you to come brief the group, he said. We think your methodology deserves a wider application. I was standing in the parking lot of a Publix in Huntsville when he said this. I remember looking at a shopping cart someone had left at a bad angle, slowly rolling toward a Toyota in the next spot. How wide? I said. Army wide, he said. Potentially joint. I drove back to my apartment and I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Abina had told me I had enough, back in February, which felt now like it had happened to a slightly different person, and I tried to think about what I was feeling. It wasn't triumph. That wasn't quite the word. Triumph has a quickness to it, a brightness. This was something slower and heavier. Relief, maybe, with something underneath it that I didn't have a name for. I thought about my father who'd come home from a war and spent decades not talking about it. I thought about what it costs to carry things alone and what it costs to put them down. I called Abena. They want to take the methodology army-wide, I said. There was a pause, and then she laughed, not a polite laugh, a real one, the kind that fills a hallway. Of course they do, she said. It was always good work, it was always yours. The conference room at Fort Meade was larger than I expected. There were 12 people around the table, 2 of them generals. One of them was the man who'd been at the briefing 18 months ago, the one who'd been stirring his coffee when I walked in, the one who'd said Ghost Actual was a heavy name for someone he'd never heard of. He was already seated when I came in. This time he looked up immediately. There was a moment, just a moment, where I saw him place me. You could watch it happen. The recognition, then the recalibration, then the careful neutrality that senior officers wear when they realize the room has changed in a way they didn't anticipate. I took my place at the front of the table. I set down my materials. I looked around the room. Good morning, I said. I'm Captain Evelyn Shaw. Some of you have read my work without knowing it was mine. I'm here to change that. Nobody laughed this time. The general set down his pen. I opened my first slide. The framework was adopted 14 months later. It's now part of the baseline curriculum at 3 Army intelligence schoolhouses and 1 joint training program. My name is on it. Not hidden in a footnote, not buried in an appendix, on the front page, in the methodology documentation, in the acknowledgements of every derivative training module. I think about Draper sometimes. Not often, but sometimes. I don't think about him the way I used to, not with the stomach-tightening anger of those months in the unit. I think about him the way you think about a storm that damaged your house. You remember it. You can see where it left marks, but you're not standing in it anymore. I think about Abena a lot more. She's a lieutenant colonel now in a post she's wanted for years. We talk on the phone every few weeks. She still has that laugh. I think about Kowalczyk, who spent 22 years being precise and used that precision to find the truth in a pile of files that no one else was looking at carefully enough. I've never met him in person. I sent him a letter once, a real one, on paper. He wrote back 2 sentences. The work spoke for itself, it always does, and I think about that conference room at Fort Meade, the general's pen going still, the particular quality of silence in a room full of people who are realizing they were wrong about something. That silence felt like enough. That silence felt finally like mine. I used to think that if you did good work, the work would protect you. That quality was its own shield. 18 months inside Draper's unit cured me of that. Slowly, the way prolonged cold cures you of believing in temporary warmth. What I've come to understand, and I don't say this lightly because it took a long time and cost something real, is that good work alone is not enough. You have to be honest about what's happening around you, even when honesty is inconvenient, especially then. I spent months telling myself that the situation was manageable, that patience would be enough, that the system would eventually correct itself without my having to push it. That was a failure of character on my part, not a virtue. The longer I waited, the more I participated in my own erasure. What finally moved me wasn't anger, though the anger was there. It was something quieter. It was sitting across from Abena at my kitchen table on a Thursday night in February, and hearing her say plainly that I already had enough, that the question was whether I was willing to use it. Character isn't the decision you make when things are easy. It's the one you make when the cost is real and visible and you make it anyway. The records I kept, the drafts, the timestamps, the encrypted drive in the safe in my apartment, those didn't come from cleverness. They came from a decision to stay clear-headed in a situation designed to make me doubt myself. Draper was good at that. He was good at creating an environment where ambiguity was weaponized, where your own uncertainty became his cover. The only way through that kind of fog is precision. You document, you think carefully. You don't let someone else's confidence substitute for your own judgment. That discipline, the refusal to stop thinking clearly even when it would have been easier to stop, is what Kowalczyk eventually found in the work. 22 years of precision, and he recognized it in 17 documents because it matched his own standard of care. And then there is the matter of staying. Not staying silent. Staying present. Continuing to do the work through 8 months of a formal review process, through an OER that called me adequate, through the particular exhaustion of fighting something while still being required to function inside it. I think about what would have meant to stop, to let the anger collapse into paralysis, or to leave before the truth had a chance to surface. Persistence isn't stubbornness. It's the decision, made quietly and repeatedly, that the outcome still matters even when the process is grinding you down. The framework has my name on it now. Every training module, every derivative document. I don't think about that the way I thought I would. What I think about is Kowalczyk's 2-sentence letter. The work spoke for itself. It always does. That's the thing about doing something real and doing it with integrity. It leaves a mark that belongs to you, even when someone else is carrying it. You just have to stay in the room long enough for the truth to find its way back.